Rishi Sunak really struck a tone of a collegiate tone, I think it's fair to say. He was very kind to the new prime minister. He was quite sort of deferential about himself. I was sat just over his shoulder. I think Rishi Sunak had a photo of his family stuck onto the folder which he was reading his speech out of on the desk, which is quite unusual. I've never seen him do that
Yeah,
before. And
yeah.
he also had a moment where he reflected on his own career, actually. He said, I have some advice for any new aspiring Labour MPs. He said, one day you'll be on the backbenches. The next, you might find yourself attending cabinet in a junior position. And then all of a sudden, you might find that the Prime Minister is in a difficult position and you are thrust into a leadership role. And just as quickly, he said, you are left wondering whether you can be an elder statesman at the age of 44. And the whole Commons chamber laughed, and it was a very light-hearted moment. But there was a bit of sadness there, I think.
We've all been poring over the text and the meaning of today's King's speech. First time, by the way, in almost three-quarters of a century that a king has made that speech at the state opening under a Labour government. Last time was in 1950 when George VI spoke for Clement Attlee's government.
My government's legislative programme will be mission-led and based upon the principles of security, fairness and opportunity for all.
That's George's successor, Charles, there. Now, among the government's long-term goals was the removal of VAT exemption from private schools, the creation of Great British Energy, the renationalisation of trains. And during the speech, King Charles confirmed the government's plans to reform the House of Lords.
Measures to modernise the Constitution will be introduced, including House of Lords reform, to remove the right of hereditary peers to sit and vote in the Lords.
Well, the leader of the opposition, as he now is, Rishi Sunak, gave a response to the plans.
Now, the party opposite has successfully tapped into the public's desire for change. But they now must deliver change, and we on this side of the House will hold them accountable for delivering on the commitments that they made to the British people.
Well, the former Prime Minister said the Chancellor now was trying to paint as bleak a picture as possible of the economy, but insisted it wasn't really fair.
Inflation at 2%, unemployment 4%, and the fastest growing economy in the G7 so far this year. The party opposite has inherited an economy that is already on an upward trajectory.
Well, Prime Minister Keir Starmer said he was there ready to step up.
Mr. Speaker, this government has been elected to deliver nothing less than national renewal, to stop the chaos of the past 14 years, turn the page on an era of politics as noisy performance, a rejection in this complicated and volatile world of those who can only offer the easy answer, the snake oil charm of populism.
Here's Starmer then. Now let's catch up with Kate McCann, our political editor, who was there at Westminster. Hello, Kate.
Hi, John.
So this programme, Kate, set out in the King's speech, it was very well advertised during the election. Do you want to just give us your take on what we've heard and what it says about the way the Starmer government is setting about its task?
Yeah, I think, look, most of the things that we read in the King's speech, we saw the King deliver in the King's speech were expected. And that's because, Labour has been quite cautious, I think, in what it intends to deliver in this first term in Parliament. That's partly down to its economic plans, the way that it wants to pursue growth in the economy, and that will be the way that it gets to do anything outside of its manifesto commitments. So most of the really big ticket items are the things that you've outlined there that we already knew about: GB Energy, some of the reforms on the economy, the planning regulations, for example. Those things are really the big things that have been talked about here in Westminster today. There are a couple of things missing, though, John. It's worth pointing out that the cut-off age for peers isn't in this King's speech. That may not come immediately, nor is the votes for 16-year-olds. It's still a commitment, but it isn't in here. So Labour has scaled back, I think, on some of its more difficult issues. But the reason for that is because Sir Keir Starmer is absolutely relentlessly pursuing this idea of economic growth and stability. And in fact, he's also set out his government's intent, if you like, because King's speeches, as you know, are just as much about telling a story to the country and selling a narrative as they are about selling a whole long list of policies. This one, incidentally, I think around 40 bills in the end. So what is his intent? What's the mission? What's this Labour government all about? Well, Keir Starmer says that it's about fixing the foundations of the nation for the long term. He says that the fight is over trust. That's the battle that will define our political era. And he's also managing expectations here. He's saying that rebuilding the country won't happen overnight. And the challenges that we face require determined, patient work and serious solutions. He says that the snake oil charm of populism may sound seductive, but it drives us into a dead end. And those were messages that he reiterated in the House of Commons this afternoon. I think one thing just to point out, I am here in the Commons. I've just left the chamber where those speeches were taking place. Midway through Keir Starmer's address, he took an intervention from one of his own backbenchers. Now, it's not unheard of, but it is quite an unusual thing to do during a King's Speech address. And he was asked about his child poverty strategy. The Prime Minister announced that there will be a new child poverty task force to get to grips with this issue of child poverty in the country. Now, what he didn't do, and what is not in the King's Speech, was to make a guarantee on removing the two-child benefit cap. Now, that is something that Labour MPs really wanted him to do. They're really pushing for. And I get the sense that this intervention in that speech and the new task force was to try and head off Labour MPs asking for that publicly, making it difficult for the new Labour government. It doesn't sound like that task force is going to go far enough. So perhaps we've seen the first issue here for a new government in Westminster.
That is interesting, Kate. He may have a force of Labour MPs the size of an army, but they're still going to take some managing, and maybe the managing is going to get a little bit stickier as time goes by. I've got to tell you, Kate, I'm practically hypnotised by the spectacle around me here at this convention in Milwaukee. But part of me wishes I was back there with you. I mean, you were there then in the chamber watching Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak on show for the first time formally doing their job in the chamber as Prime Minister and leader of the opposition. How did they do?
Yeah, John, I have to say, I think you're missing out here because it really is a fundamental shift of power. I was looking in the wrong direction, I have to admit. I was looking towards the wrong side of the House of Commons, expecting to see Sir Keir Starmer. But of course, everybody's moved because they've shifted over to the government benches. There are far too many new Labour MPs to fit on the government benches. Many were standing, lots sitting in the banks where usually you would see advisors sitting in the House of Commons. And the atmosphere, look, today is an unusual day. It won't be like this again. It might be, but probably not likely. Rishi Sunak really struck a tone of a collegiate tone, I think it's fair to say. He was very kind to the new Prime Minister. He was quite sort of deferential about himself. I think I was sat just over his shoulder. I think Rishi Sunak had a photo of his family stuck onto the folder which he was reading his speech out of on the desk, which is quite unusual. I've never seen him do that before.
Yeah.
And he also had a moment where he reflected on his own career, actually. He said, I have some advice for any new aspiring Labour MPs. He said, one day you'll be on the backbenches. The next you might find yourself attending cabinet in a junior position. And then all of a sudden, you might find that the Prime Minister is in a difficult position and you are thrust into a leadership role. And just as quickly, he said, you are left wondering whether you can be an elder statesman at the age of 44. And the whole Commons chamber laughed, and it was a very light-hearted moment. But there was a bit of sadness there, I think, from Rishi Sunak, and it was reflected in the way that Keir Starmer spoke of him. Starmer said that from Rishi Sunak's response, that it had gone above and beyond what was usually expected, the usual standards of generosity, and I thank him for that. So they were very warm to each other this afternoon.
That is a strangely compelling insight. The idea of the old Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, looking at a picture of his beloved family while he's starting off on the route, not for very long though, of being leader of the opposition. Just a bit of moral reinforcement there with that picture of the family.